Well, I make films about my heroes, and Bob was a hero of mine. I read, there was a book called Altman by Mitch Zukov, and it was an oral history of Bob. And I called Mitch up and asked if there was anyone who approached him to make a documentary about his book. And he said, if you want to make a film about Robert Altman, you have to talk to Catherine Altman. And so I thought, well, that's never going to happen. And by coincidence, the Torino Film Festival mounted a retrospective of Bob's films. And Catherine was there. So I flew to Torino, just, thinking that, maybe I would run into her. And if not, I would enjoy, seeing Bob's films for 3 days, and I was in Torino. So, I wound up meeting Catherine, and I said I would love to make a film about Bob, her late husband. And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't know. And I think she liked that. I thought it's how do you scale a mountain? And so she said, well, send me your movies. I'll think about it. And after the holidays, she called me and said, I would love to have you make this film. And I grew up watching Bob's films in the 1970s. I had a great affection for Bob. Bob reinvented film, cinema, the way we make films and how we view ourselves. And I think he was America's greatest filmmaker. There's John Ford, although Bob never liked John Ford. Bob was inspiring to so many filmmakers. Paul Anderson, who's in the film, Richard Linklater, David Gordon Green. And I think the one thing that really you get from Bob's films, at least I get from Bob's films, is that they weren't perfect. They were handmade. They were, they were made by an artist, and they were unpredictable. They didn't have happy endings, and he stands in contrast to Hollywood filmmaking, which is, nowadays, the sequels and comic book movies. I think Robert Altman showed that it was possible to make independent films, to make good films, and and for me, he was a countercultural filmmaker. He was older than the new Hollywood, Scorsese and others. But without Bob, I guess without Bob there wouldn't be. There was, I don't know. He was a brave road that others drove on. Well, I didn't want to make a conventional film where you interview subjects and they tell war stories and then you illustrate it. And I saw the definitions as almost chapter headings, but it's also that the people like Lily Tomlin Paul Thomas Anderson, Michael Murphy. You know, Bob collaborated with his cast and crew and created a family. It was very special. And everyone has just a sort of different view of I mean, there's so many sides to Robert Altman. It's sort of a prism in which to like. It's you know it's convenient to label you know Altman, and this is the one thing that happened, and you can sort of see all of his movies through that one definition. But Bob. It's kind of the way the film structure came about was that I just didn't think that you could, excuse me, define Bob in as one thing. I mean, he was so he impacted on so many different people, and I mean, you could talk about Bob in terms of his ensemble filmmaking, but then you can look at Secret Honor, where there's just, you know, one performer. His work is, I guess his work is just so unpredictable, and you know, the kind of, if I had overloaded the film with celebrities, it just would have been a completely different kind of take on it. And I wanted Bob to tell his own story as opposed to others. I saw Wim Wenders' Pina, about Pina Bausch, and at the end, I mean, I liked the movie, but I really wanted to hear from Pina Bausch, and instead, so that made me think, wow, wouldn't it be great if it just had Robert Altman telling his story? Well, you know, Bob made movies, he directed operas, he also wrote music, and the first song in the film was written by Bob. I went to the archives, his archive at the University of Michigan, and I dug out sheet music because he had worked on a Broadway musical, and had John Medeski from Medeski, Martin and Wood, a jazz musician, play it for the first time. And music was central to Bob's work. And chronologically, you know, I wanted to use jazz because he loved jazz. If you look at a film like Kansas City, you know, I think Bob listened to Duke Ellington very early on and became a lover of jazz music. But take a look at McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I mean, you can't separate that film from Leonard Cohen. I mean, he had a real affinity to putting, you know, scores together. And some of them were very humorous. The Long Goodbye is just one song that's just played all the way through the film. Even when Elliot Gould rings the doorbell, you hear the theme of The Long Goodbye. In my case, I was, you know, music is used as a narrative as well. So they're historical artifacts because the film is composed of footage, home movies, and music of the period. So as you're going along through his life, you're hearing the music from that time. And in a way, it helps the narrative of the film. When you hear, you know, the Guess Who sing "No Time," it puts you in the '60s. And
it was very effective.
But, you know, I can talk about. There's actually so much you can talk about with music. Nashville, and there's a lot of performance in Bob's films. Prairie Home Companion, In California Suite, which is one of my favorite films, there's the blues musician that is playing all the way through it, and you know a lot about those characters and the environment. Bob was a naturalist filmmaker, and the inclusion of music was because music is part of life. Bob in the film says, I make gloves, they sell shoes. And it's just that it's a completely different way of looking at film. There's mall movies, and then there's the independent films. Bob railed against film schools where they would teach you on page 10 there had to be a car chase, and then on page 15 there had to be an explosion. And that formulaic filmmaking was, it's just boring. And at the very end of the movie, Catherine talks about a movie that Bob saw called Brief Encounter by David Lean, and falling in love with the main character, who was, not a babe, not glamorous, and I think what he was about was what he was after was truthful human behavior and portraying things as they really are.